I was at the Brewers Twins game last night. It was a good game. No matter who won or lost the game. I'll let you know where my allegiances lie. Else at other times, but I was talking with my friend I went with, and what would your walk-up song be if you were, a pitcher coming out, getting ready, warming up, going out from the bullpen or a starter, or if you're a batter, going up to the plate, what would your walk-up song be? I can start.
Yeah.
I told him mine would probably be Do You Believe in a Thing Called Love by The Darkness, or Mr. Brightside by The Killers. Like something that like people like understand and then like can kind of like get a little bit of juice with, and kind of get the crowd into it. So
I like it. I like it. Tara and Kelsey, we'll give people time to think. I don't know if you guys have an idea. Let's say, Tara, you got anything?
Oh my gosh, no, I'm like the one question I'm not prepared for. I love music, so
That's
it's
tough
so
one.
hard for me to choose like one. Can I do like a mashup of like
Nope,
5
one.
in a
One,
row?
one.
Get one.
And it's only like
I
a
could go all night.
10-second
I'm
like part of the song.
Yeah.
So it's real
And
short.
I'm a classic rock guy, so mine's gonna be AC/DC Back in Black.
See, you took mine.
Nice.
That was my first initial gut thought. I was like,
Yeah.
and then I was like, I don't know if I'm
Really?
cool enough for that. So yeah, that was gonna be mine. And then I
Kelsey,
was
you're
like,
too young for that as your walk-up song.
but it's classic. You have to. But I think if I was choosing a more updated song, quote unquote, What Me Worry by Portugal the Man has kind of got like a little like pep in its step enough that you're like, okay, you got like enough little like juicing up the crowd just a little bit without trying too hard, because I just don't think that I'm cool enough for AC/DC. Not yet.
I would go with Van Halen Eruption.
Okay. Yes.
Another classic.
Mm-hmm. Right, Tara, what'd you come up with?
I would do like some country song that's like nice and easy, and then I'd get up to the plate and just hit home run. So people are like, oh, she's just only gonna get like a base hit and just wow the crowd, be like, oh wow, she's really good. So I don't know. George Strait's my favorite country singer, so it'd be like Oceanfront Property or something like that. Very country.
Okay, if you played it backwards, you'd run the bases backwards and get all your stuff back.
Whatever works. Whatever keeps the crowd into it. All for entertainment.
Please. So when I heard this question earlier, I couldn't think of one, but the song that got stuck in my head was Walking on Sunshine, which is just so out of left field, and I love it. I love it. Everybody's got these like rock songs, and I'm just walking on sunshine. Yeah.
I like it a lot, Ariel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it.
Oh my gosh.
I feel like you can definitely get the crowd into that one too. Where it's just
Yes.
like, yes, like
Everybody's
let's
into
go.
it.
Yeah.
I think a Frank Sinatra song or something like that can always be good on those walk-up songs too. Just
Yeah.
Just get
I
real
love
classy
it.
with it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's
I
a lot
love
of good
it.
options.
Yeah.
In all
Well,
genres,
yeah.
there's a lot of good options.
Yeah.
we should definitely have some walkout music today, because we've got some heavy hitters on this podcast. Kelsey, Tara, and myself are joined by Chris, one of our founders, Kyle, our CEO and president, and Andrew, our customer strategy advisor, is back to continue our CIT Origin series. I know on previous episodes we discussed the early 80s, early 90s, our physical locations, and in this episode we're gonna deep dive a little bit into CIT's connection with manufacturing. And I know Andrew had some burning questions, so I'll just kind of throw it to you, and you can kind of take it away from here.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys coming back for, third time around. But so we talked about the manufacturer's manual. And was that just like an industry? Like it was, so you found it for, I was trying to like thinking of what the purpose of that manual was, and then how you utilized it as essentially a marketing sales tool. Is it usually meant for manufacturer industries? Oh, I need XYZ part, or, you go through and then that's what that manual was used for?
Yeah, no, keep in mind, Andrew, that this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, and there really wasn't electronic mailing lists, there wasn't electronic marketing, there wasn't all the social media today. So how did you find potential customers, prospects? How did you do that back then? Well, we used a lot of manual lists. And when we started, we had a big focus on Western Wisconsin because we felt from geographical, it wasn't well attended by the resellers out of the metro. It wasn't well covered by the Wisconsin because most of them came out of Madison or east of Madison. So what we found is a product called the Minnesota and Wisconsin Manufacturers Register. And this particular, and this is a book at the time, keep in mind, this is not an electronic list, it's not a CD, it's not out in the worldwide cloud world today like we think of it. It was a book. So I said, hey, let's just start going through. And the really cool thing about this book is it was broken down by counties and cities and industrial parks, right? So we could go real specific to Hudson, Wisconsin, manufacturers, and right there we had them. We had size of the company, what they did, contacts, who their executives were. And what we found, this was kind of happen chance, is that a lot of those manufacturers were starting their transition from what we talked about in one of our other origins, from the typewriter and terminal to putting PCs on the desk and starting to use some of the client server compute technologies in the manufacturing space, one of which was engineering and drawing and CAD and all that stuff. So it was just a really good reference book to help us. And a lot of those Western Wisconsin towns have these business parks with manufacturers. That's how we ended up there. I mean, it wasn't real well planned, but it ended up being a really well planned, well executed segment for CIT to grow.
How did you find the book? Like, how did you find the registry? Was it just like you saw it on somebody's desk and you're like, hey, we could use that? Like, you know what I mean?
I think, to be honest, we found it on a client's desk.
Okay.
Right? And we're like, well, what is this? Right. So we started, I'm like, wow, this is a perfect resource, because when we first started, we had a couple of good manufacturing customers, right? So we're like, that could be a huge market. So how do we find all these manufacturers?
Yeah.
Well, lo and behold, here comes the Minnesota and the Wisconsin Manufacturers Register, which has exact information that we wanted.
Okay.
In a printed format of book. Somewhere around here in the office, there's still these books from every year, because then they'd republish them every year with the new updates.
Yeah.
So.
And was that, so you were probably at a manufacturer's, you saw it on their desk, and is that mainly meant for that industry to be like, hey, I need, like a part built so you can go through, or like, what is that? Like,
no,
usually
it's
meant for,
it's more of a prospecting platform. It's more of a marketing and prospecting. It's not really digging into what we do, what we make, how can we, it's more business information. Who are we? Where are we? How big are we? Who are our executives? How do you contact us? So it was much more of a marketing product than it was anything else. I think, when I look back at it and when I've looked at it recently, because actually it's funny we're talking about this today, because I just brought it up to Tara again. I said, hey, we should look back into that, because it was a really, really good, concise resource for us to use for marketing.
Yeah. What did you find anything else on customer desks that maybe used as a resource, or
nothing we wanted to disclose, probably?
Yeah.
No, but you know what I did?
Recording, right?
So this kind of goes back to the origins, but what I did early on when I was, right, because Mark was kind of doing the technical delivery, I was doing the sales and business development, I was kind of doing it all. So what I would do is I would deliver my product out to our customers, and what I would do is I'd look around their office and I'd try to find who else was shipping boxes into there. I'd look for labels, right? So were they buying from Micro Center? Were they buying from CW? Where were they getting their gear? Because then it would help me figure out, how can I chip away at that? And then I started to do that with every customer. And then as we brought on sales staff, I said, keep an eye out for who else is shipping boxes into your clients. It'll give you some pretty good insight as to who they're working with, which is awesome. So.
Yeah, and Kyle, did you have something similar on the, technical side when you were, maybe installing stuff that
Oh yeah,
you
we
saw
talked a
stickers
lot. I
and
mean, so when we'd be out doing the deployment services and stuff on it, we provide a lot of feedback. And as a technician, you tend to get a lot more disclosure from the customers on kind of what's going on too. So you get a lot of insight as to where things are at. You're touching the gear that they're buying, so you're kind of seeing what they're using and where the needs are. So that helps to kind of map out greatly where we could enhance or add to the offerings to go through it. Many of these manufacturers that Chris sent us into side were, they had some main system. They had like a AS400, they had a DEC VAX, they had some mini, mainframe system, for lack of a better term, that was, kind of a green screen system that kind of evolved through the 80s, late 70s, 80s side. That was what they were running their manufacturing systems on. So when these PCs hit the desk, we were generally plugging in, a Novell server, maybe a peer-to-peer, but mostly a Novell server along with the PCs, and then some kind of connectivity software for that mainframe. Was pretty much what happened. And that just kind of evolved more and more as those mainframes kind of slowly died out and you got more and more power on the PC side. It transitioned where the ERP systems flipped over to the other side, and then those ERP systems kind of died out because they obviously were expensive.
yeah. Well, and then I'm sure Active Directory through Windows, helped with that. So you didn't have to have the back end of Novell to do a lot of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, Active Directory didn't really show up until around 2000, so we had almost a decade before those hit. But Novell had their directory services side of it, so Novell really invented that directory side. And even before that, though, just the old original Novell just had essentially created user accounts with a password. That was it. I mean, you had some simple group permission sides that you assigned, shared folders and those things. So it was very simple, but the needs were simple. So it kind of met. But as it evolved, like technology does, it just continued to enhance and expand side with it. And when Novell created that replication of this directory service that allowed for replication expansion, that was purely in response to just the expansion of bringing those apps in. And I think Banyan Vines actually was probably the leader side originally on that side of it. Novell kind of took that, but there was a kind of a niche side. It existed on some very large enterprise called Banyan. We really didn't do anything with it because it was a pretty large scale. It didn't really fit the small market, but that's kind of how you saw things evolve. You just kind of saw these technologies, and it was really exciting because it was kind of Wild West. Things were really evolving quickly, and there was a lot of evolving, I'll say standards loosely. Yeah. There's things that manufacturers come out and say, hey, do this. And, sometimes it sticks, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it wasn't the group that brought it to market that became, ultimately leader, a la Microsoft. Microsoft's kind of the master of that. They don't necessarily invent, but they certainly enhance and bring it to market, and that's kind of where it evolved out of. But
yeah, a lot of times we talked about this, and I've talked about it in the other origins, is the transition from typewriter and terminals to technology, right? Because I kind of use that as even when I talk to our customers today, right? We helped with the transition from typewriter and a terminal to putting a PC and connecting it to more technology, which just started opening up more and more options for these, not only manufacturers, but it was really starting to be all of our clients to say, okay, well, we used to type a letter on a typewriter and put it in the mail. Then we started faxing, and then now we can do that all on a PC, and then we electronic, start to send, and we start to get rid of these main core big minis and mainframes and move it out to the desktop. I mean, that was just a huge transition. And for some reason, manufacturers seem to jump on that faster. And I think a lot of it, and I don't know if you think this, Kyle, but I think a lot of it had to do with engineering and CAD and drawing and sharing of files, and they were big needs for that. So I think manufacturing was really a good industry to start to kick that. And keep in mind, this was all, we were doing it all on site, right? We had no remote support, no remote connectivity. So not only was I going on site dropping gear off, like Kyle said, they were going on site and installing it all, working with the clients. And like he said, the client looked at Kyle and Mark as technical advisors, not as salespeople like myself. So they tended to give them more information than they give me. I just had to look at boxes, try to find the labels.
So talking about those shifts, did you in technology, so the typewriter, letter to like the terminal, and then the desktop. You said you kind of noticed it and like maybe the increase in the product. Were there other shifts that you noticed, or is it more of like a looking back, like, oh, that was a transformational like time? And I'm just thinking about with I know on our other podcasts we've talked about like AI and machine learning and how that's being integrated into things, and that I don't think it's an if, it's a when that's going to change how we work. And I can see that as a shift of, okay, so we went from, typewriters to, desktops. Do you notice those changes when you're in those, or did you notice those, and how CIT could adapt to that change?
Well, I mean, I think it's very similar to what we're going through, as you mentioned, with AI. It was that big of transitional change because we had, typing of letters on a typewriter, and maybe the next step was you faxed them, right? You put them in a fax machine and you sent them via facsimile versus sending them in the mail. But when we started to implement, client server PC computing, where we started internally sharing of files, right? Where we could share files and start sharing some spreadsheets and sharing CAD drawings, things like that. What changed next, which I think is very similar to AI today, is the invention of the internet into business, right? So they could use internet as their protocol to start transferring this stuff via the big giant World Wide Web out there, which eliminated faxing, which eliminated postal mailing, right? Because when we started to integrate internet early on into businesses, they used it really just for sending email, right? That was the big thing they were doing. There wasn't all the browsing because we really hadn't got to the e-commerce stage yet. That came, after 2000. So early on, it was, now we have this PC, we have these files we've been sharing internally, but now we can actually share them externally to the rest of the world using the internet. So I think that was a huge change. And then came the 2000, not only just the Y2K change, but then came the e-commerce stage of what everyone was doing, saying, hey, we can start to transact and do business on the internet. Huge game changer, very similar to what's going to happen with AI, machine learning, and all that.
Yeah. And I could see that with also the documentation change, where you're going from the typewriter, but then you put e-commerce in there, and then you have to have labels, you have to have the POs, you have to have all that tracking internally to say, okay, well, what do we do with all this information that we have now? On the education side of those newer technologies, did you have to really talk about what the capabilities or the limitations were? I just think it's one of my pet peeves is how we attach things to emails. Email was never meant to have like giant files sent. And that's as a, somebody who has worked in the help desk for many years, where people are trying to send, gigs and gigs, and you're like, no, it's not meant to do that. Were there any of those instances while being like putting these new things or helping customers along, of educating them with, the limitations?
It was all relative. I mean, you got to remember, these are very low graphics environments typically. So many of them were, it was Word Perfect, for example. It wasn't Microsoft Word, it was Word Perfect and Word Star and those things. Essentially, they weren't even, ran in Windows. They ran from DOS. And size is pretty relative. We're talking, entire servers were in megabytes, not gigabytes. I mean, these are, everything was pretty relative. So you got to really multiply it way down. So, I mean, we look at like email attachment limit sends of 30 mega an attachment. I mean, there's ties back to original, just data transfer times. I mean, we thought we had a high speed connection for a customer, and we put an ISDN line in there that essentially was 128K of nailed up bandwidth. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I mean, what would seem by today's standards is horribly painful speeds was very ample for what the needs were for the connectivity side of that. And the internet really didn't come along. I mean, again, until pretty late in the game on where this was changing side of it. So the initial change was being able to be not dependent on these larger mainframes where all their data resided. And like Chris said, you started to now have documents that all became, easily more accessible, easier to edit and change and reuse for ordering and templates, the power of spreadsheets to be able to do calculations, and then even relational databases, your DB3, DB2 stuff, well, basically Microsoft Access side, Microsoft's foray into that as it went through there, kind of opened the door to self-service data that really wasn't, if you go back a few years, for many of them wasn't, easily accessible, was very, very expensive, because being a programmer in for one of these mini or, mainframe stuff was very expensive. Many of these manufacturers had teams. That's what they did. They had full-time employees. I mean, and that was usually who we wound up working with many times. They were the data people for these larger systems, and so you're talking 3, 4, 5 FTEs, just to run these and manage the systems to handle the data requests. And now it starts to evolve where it becomes a little more self-service. You started to have engineers who obviously running CAD are very, very smart. They tend to be very, highly, very willing to engage technology. They were fun to work with. I mean, they pretty much fully embraced, and they were willing to try things because it was enabling so much more access to things they just never had. So there's I think a tremendous appreciation for the technology because it was really turned on. It is a liken to that AI, when you have where you just go, wow, look at what that produced. That was a similar feeling. That's a good correlation, because when you could extract these data and these reports, stuff that used to take them, they'd wait months to get, or they just could never obtain it, to be able to get it themselves through a database or on the side, people were like, wow, this is huge. This saves me so much time. So there was just a lot of energy and enthusiasm behind that. So whenever something new would come out, you just kind of floated by and be like, yeah, let's try it. They were very willing to always try, things as they came through, and email became part of that, said, oh, here's this new internet, let's try that out, and you bring that into the equation.
And email was then on premise, right? Were you using Exchange or Novell, or what?
No,
what did that look like?
Originally it was internal first, no okay. Internet side of it. Yeah. So you're doing some simple emails internally side through Novell had GroupWise. I forget what was it called before GroupWise. I was trying to remember. They had a name for something.
I only remember back to GroupWise, and then Microsoft came out with PC Mail, right?
Yeah, and then there's PC Mail, like Windows for Workgroups kind of had an integrated email kind of protocol side of these things that they'd work with. Again, Exchange really didn't show up on the landscape until around 2000 or so. That showed up, and so Novell had their GroupWise, and there was Lotus Notes was gaining a lot of popularity, and Lotus Notes had some unique, more collaborative stuff. It's a more, they allowed you to kind of create forms and custom data entry sites. Had some very unique aspects to it itself. Lotus was acquired by IBM. So you kind of envision, IBM had, large enterprise stuff on it. So there was a lot of that going on. You got to remember throughout the 90s stuff, there was a lot of jockeying to kind of for what was going to kind of evolve to be the de facto system. You had IBM promoting OS2 originally with Microsoft, and then Microsoft abandoning that, and you still had IBM promoting OS2 as the graphical. You had Apple out there with their Macintosh GUI, and then you had Microsoft kind of quickly trying to get Windows jockeyed into place stuff on it. I think DOS being the predominant side of it, Microsoft kind of by securing the DOS side had a bit of had to step up on everybody's side with that. But there's still a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of jockeying on where that was going to go. So you kind of had people getting into camps on which technology they liked. It's nowadays that's pretty agnostic, right? We don't spend a lot of time worrying about that as much because it's so web-based, but it was interesting times through that. It was fun. It was actually a lot of fun because you could really experiment with a lot of different things.
You could really see everything and who offered what and how, and okay.
The other thing to understand, Andrew, when you talk about files and attaching and size and how big they are, back then, remember most of this was just text, right? There was no graphics yet. The marketing departments weren't creating all these big giant graphical multicolored, because not only was it text, it was in amber or green, right? Two colors. So it was really, if you think, I always go back to the typewriter and the terminal. Well, all we were doing is really scraping that text from the typewriter and from the terminal and putting it onto a PC and putting it into an electronic document. But those documents were very, very text. I mean, there was no logo on them. There was no graphics on them. There was no color on them. We were sending black and white text documents. So it was very, very simple, right? So as performance and speed and size of the networks increased, so did marketing and putting all the fancy stuff into all these documents. So did the engineers with all these big 3D files. So it all kind of moved and grew together. As the technology grew, it grew along with it, right? So it was an interesting transition, because the GUI interface didn't really exist when we started, right? Like Kyle said, it was all DOS based, it was text based, right? We didn't have a GUI interface. We were like, what's a GUI? A lot of people don't remember we didn't have this Windows GUI interfaces before, right? We started as text command line.
Yeah. I think about that sometimes working in the terminal, where it's just like, some work at, for university work, and it's just like you got to do everything through the terminal, and you're just like, I just want to just take my mouse and click, and you couldn't do that,
No, there was no mouse.
There wasn't a mouse.
There was no mouse, yeah. Well, even the initial versions of Windows, they ran on top of DOS. I mean, you literally started at the command prompt, you type win, and then it loaded the Windows interface. I mean, it was really just a DOS app on top. So it's like, we spent many years doing that. I mean, and the Windows would crash because you run out of memory, because DOS used 640K. I mean, that was DOS's memory usage. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's tiny. And it was fun times. I mean, I went through those. The other piece that kind of occurred through their side, just to note, is the use of those online services, the CompuServes, the AOLs really evolved through that 90s side of those. And we did use, specifically a lot of times around support, we used a lot of CompuServe. CompuServe is where Novell's sports forums were. That's where Microsoft supports forums were, because they didn't have websites at the time. There was no website, so you didn't. So the knowledge base for help on those was on the CompuServe forum. So we'd have to get on our modems, dial up into the CompuServe, go log into those forums and search those forums. That's where we got updated drivers for the network cards and all those things. That's where you converse with other folks in your industry side of it. So first social networks really evolved out of what these CompuServe forums, AOL forum stuff, that was social networking. We were doing that in the 90s. It was just didn't call it that. But you know, that's how we conversed and help troubleshoot. You post things out there saying, this is, I can't figure this out. Do you guys, anybody have any suggestions, or have you seen this? And you get responses to it. You know, so there was access there, but that was, you know, that was an invaluable tool for us engineering wise. CompuServe was, we spent a lot of time on that.
I know we're running up on time, but did you see difference? So I think of the big Apple IIe push that they had in schools, and it's, you know, it was a huge push to get that into schools, and they did that. Did you see differences in industries? If you were in manufacturing, did they have a different, like, they liked, you know, IBM or, you know, Windows or DOS or whatever versus like a school, or you know, a retail or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, I'd say we definitely did, because you predominantly we correlate the schools to Apple products.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, whether it's those, if they were heavy in design or they were marketing, they were Macintosh. And they generally ran Local Talk, which was Mac's, you know, or Apple Talk side of it. It was their custom networking protocol of kind of peer-to-peer sharing within Macs. And then we had, you know, if the customer was running AS400, we'd say they have an IBM rep, they're pro IBM. So, you know, we may, for example, we'd find that they'd have an AS400, they may wind up with Lotus Notes, for example.
Okay.
Versus, you know, so they would be very much getting a lot of information from their IBM side of it, because the IT director, again, probably came from that mainframe or, you know, AS400 background.
Yep.
So, and they were always subscribed to say, I never got fired for buying IBM, right? Nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. That was very, very common. So, you know, that IT director would buy Lotus Notes. They would buy, you know, IBM servers. They would, you know, they'd buy
Yeah,
IBM gear.
Unlike today, the devices back then were much more purpose driven, right? It was, you know, education in Apple, and manufacturing was typically more, you know, Windows and PC based, right? Because the applications were driving more of that. Today, it's, you know, really an endpoint device that it doesn't necessarily matter. You can do most everything cross platform, but back in the early days, it was really purpose driven devices, right? What do you know, like Kyle said, if you're in the marketing and you're in the graphical and you're in the design or you're in education, you know, a lot more Apple Mac based product platform, right? And they were not as easy to integrate into the rest of the business space, the mainframe space, and, you know, the server space back then. Today, it's very open platform. I mean, a lot of that has to do when Apple kind of embraced Microsoft, they started to partner more, and we moved some of those applications that were traditionally all PC Windows based to run on the Mac OS. It was a huge game changer and made really the device agnostic to some degree.
Yeah.
And when I got called in to integrate a Mac into the Novell network, that was a bad day. That usually sucked. That was never a good
that was gonna be my
experience.
next question of, you know, Chris on the sales side and Kyle on the technical side, did you have a preference? Either, you know, if it was, you know, you made a better margin or it was easier to sell to IBM, as you said, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. Or Kyle, if you're like, oh man, I do not want to work on, you know, this network today because I know it's going to be, you know, a bear and a half.
I mean, from a technical side, I was always, I worked on whatever. I mean, I worked on all this. I mean, I was able to kind of always willing to take on a challenge and go through it, but I just knew you were very limited on what Apple was embracing, as far as Apple was a very locked ecosystem. So trying to get them connected, again, you just knew the results to the customer are probably not going to be what they were looking for. So
I have
again,
to
you
set those expectations right away. I'm just
you have
being
to
like,
set the
I'm
expectations,
gonna do as much as I
say,
can.
yeah, we'll do as much as we can. You know, we'll find out how to get this to work to the best of our ability side of that. And it was always a fun challenge. I mean, I did some OS2 connectivity, I did Mac connectivity, I did, you know, the Windows, still had DOS. So you got a little bit of everything, but I always kept an open mind willing to take on the challenge to go through that side of it. As long as the customer kind of understood, again, it was all new. So there wasn't like, you know, there was somebody out there that had 10 years experience with it. Didn't exist. Stuff had
Yeah.
been out there for 1 or 2 years. There's very few people. It's just like everything was kind of, okay, we'll give it a shot. And see what we find
Yeah.
out.
And to tie back to your manufacturing, you know, kind of how you started this, Andrew, the manufacturing space was very, very heavy PC based, right? It really was more, there again, it was that purpose built, right? The PC plugged in, you know, played with other platforms well. It was an easy transition. But we always had those outliers that say, well, you know, we've got this other device. Most of the time it was some Apple-based, Mac-based, some off-brand product that we had to try to integrate in. And you could do it, but you had to do a lot of workarounds in order to make it function like the purpose-built device, which was kind of defaulted to the PC and the manufacturer space, right? Because then we ran into it with engineering, we ran into it with marketing and design and graphics. So we had to start figuring out how do we integrate these platforms better, you know. And today, like I said, you know, we're pretty much device agnostic. Doesn't really matter what the end user wants. We can make it work, and the applications are such that they work cross-platform.
Yeah.
But it wasn't always the case back in the early days.
Yeah. When I think
Well,
about
I remember IBM doing some dedicated OS2 machines for some of those, again, because OS2 was being promoted by IBM. They actually have, you know, software solutions that were marketed in specifically around, say, like label printing or specific function sides of it, because OS2 was the first truly multitasking operating system you get. So they could actually have two processes run at the same time, which, you know, you couldn't do that with Windows. You can only do one thing. That was all it could do. It task swapped. It did not multitask. OS2 Warp could. So you wind up with this OS2 Warp machine on the manufacturing floor, and they needed to pull some data off of it to talk to it. So we had to network it. We had to figure out how to network this OS2 machine, which again, it's like speaking, you know, Spanish and English. I mean, similar, but it's different. You know, it's inherently different. You know, so you had to kind of learn two languages there.
And then all the networking side was, you know, learning on the job, right, Kyle? Like, it was, you know, like, okay, here's how we build a network and, you know, architect it and put it all together, because, you know, we can go in on a, you know, in another one on a more technical side if we wanted to, because like even, you know, it was probably over 10 years ago when I was at university, but we still learned about ring networks versus star networks and how those are just internal architectures of how to build an internal network, when now it's like you buy a switch and you just plug everything in, right? You don't really have that technical side anymore.
Yeah, we didn't always have Ethernet as a standard.
Yeah, we had a lot of
We
that.
forget that, right?
Yeah.
We had customers, again, the IBM customers had Token Ring. Token Ring had 4 meg, and then they had 816 meg, you know, so they were different. And then you had coaxial Ethernet, you had thick Ethernet on some of these, and then you had the versions of, you know, 10 base T for twisted pair, and you even have some deviance from that because pre-standard. So yeah, it was a wild west of, and we'd have customers that have multiples of the same technology running in there. So it was interesting.
Well,
A whole nother topic, Andrew.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
say.
maybe that's version 4.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the next one.
The infrastructure changes of the last 35 years.
Yeah, I love it. As we kind of finish up here, my closing question is on a little bit higher level, when you're thinking about CIT back in the day, you know, going into those manufacturing, having those conversations, and CIT today, are the conversations similar? Are you still solving the similar problems, different technology, but for manufacturing, kind of back then and now? What are you sort of seeing, or has it changed?
Well, I mean, they're still doing the same thing. At the end of the day, they're still manufacturing, making widgets. I think we've just taken what was 35 years ago much more manual processing and moved it to electronic processing, which has pushed all this technology, all the devices, all the connectivity. It's pushed everything, right? But at the end of the day, we're still solving the exact same problem. We're just doing it with a lot different tool set, software set, devices, much more efficient, right? We'll call it, because we can multitask and we can do more. But I mean, they're still making the same thing as they were 35 years ago. They're using technology much differently to do it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, and very similar. We're still looking at what they're trying to accomplish and then finding newer and better ways for technology to augment and help improve those processes and how they do it, you know. And again, when you talk about AI and those things, that's kind of, you know, a good correlation of what that could potentially do to increase efficiencies of how they manufacture and provide their products to the market. And I think that's, again, same end game as Chris mentioned. It's just, you know, we're just doing it with newer and better technologies as it evolved, and that's kind of what we were doing back then. Things are a lot faster, of course, and I think the impacts are even bigger on where they go. But same idea.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you, Chris, Kyle, and Andrew for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, like, subscribe, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. You can contact us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast, and we'll be back next week with an all-new episode.